welcome to SouthCoast Matters. I'm Paul Latendra, she's Julie Taylor.
And welcome. SouthCoast Matters is a public access television program where we bring together business leaders, civic leaders, and citizens to discuss how we can work in harmony to make the South Coast a positive place.
And we try to have interesting conversations with some pretty intelligent people. And we try to learn some new stuff along the way. Today's interesting guest is Joe Avellone. We're pleased to have Joe here. Joe's worn a number of different hats over the years, so tell us what he's worn, Julie.
Well, a few things, just a few for the list. You're currently Executive Vice President at PAREXEL International in Waltham. You've been the COO of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, a surgeon at Peter Bent Brigham Hospital, and a candidate for governor, as well as in the Navy. That's very important to me. My dad was in the Navy as well.
Oh, that's true. Thank you.
And Joe's a graduate of Dartmouth College. He did his doctoral work for his MD at Harvard. Get that right?
Yes.
Then Master's in Public Administration from the Kennedy School at Harvard University. Father of 3, grandfather of 3. What are we missing?
All true. I think you pretty much covered it. Lousy golfer.
I can identify with that.
And just before we get started, I just want to disclose that Joe and I worked together on his campaign writing policy. So just
and it was
disclose that.
Indispensable, and I was so pleased to have been able to work with you, Julie.
Thank you.
In your campaign, you did very well in this area. I know that. I think Taunton was your stronghold, probably.
I did have a lot of, I thought, great support, certainly a lot of great friends in the whole South Coast area. And then Worcester was another kind of place where we found a lot of support. So I would say moderate and slightly conservative areas of the state, from the Democratic perspective, is where we found the most support.
Looking at a state map, blue and red, we're considered a blue state, but there's a lot more red ink on the map than there is blue ink because the rural areas are all red and the urban areas are blue and they have all the votes. But it's a good learning experience, I'm sure, just running for governor.
Oh, it was just an incredible experience, and I mean that in a very positive way. I couldn't have been more pleased, nor my wife, really, for having had the opportunity to run. You meet literally thousands of really great people, well-meaning people. So I never would want to trade.
You met me a couple of times.
I did, I certainly did, yes.
What more could you ask for, really?
And I think we were in 153 towns, and I'm sure I was in some of them, like Fall River, 15 times in Taunton, and we, I know every Dunkin' Donuts in the Commonwealth now, and most of the Panera Breads, and all the places where you'd have to stop and either meet people or wait to go meet people.
And use the restroom.
And exactly.
Good.
What was the most interesting thing you learned about the Commonwealth while you were running for governor?
It's funny because other people have asked that, and I think it's the amount of diversity there is in such a small space, such a small state. I mean, we're really a very small state geographically, and with 6 million, maybe 6.5 population, a small state population-wise, but in that small area, there's tremendous diversity in the kinds of occupations, from the things that are, most common in around Boston to other parts of the state, and obviously ethnic diversity, and certainly the regional economies are quite different. So I thought for such a small state, there's a tremendous amount of diversity. That makes it much, much more interesting than a lot of other smaller states who are so homogeneous.
Most people are amazed at how much agriculture and dairy farming we have in this compact state.
In the western part of the state, absolutely. And so that also highlights the fact that the interests in what they would like the state government to do vary pretty tremendously from region to region.
Sure. Tell me how you got from being a surgeon to running for governor. That's a big step.
Yeah, it is a long, strange, eclectic, I guess would be the word, ride. The theme that goes through it is health policy. I did start out life as wanting to be a doctor and becoming a doctor, really with the idea that I would practice medicine. But as I got further along at Harvard Medical School and then even into my residency at the Brigham, I most people in those academic residencies do something in addition to clinical practice. They either do research or they do teaching, and that's the way their career is going to go. And for me, I was interested in health policy, which way back in the 70s was pretty nascent compared to the idea of health policy today. So I was interested in how our health system worked and how it could work better, et cetera, more than clinical research on a kind of operation or anything like that. And that's why I went to the Kennedy School, actually, to get a master's degree instead of doing research. So really, it was from that idea, health policy, that I kind of set out on my my career. I practiced as a practicing surgeon for some years, and then got interested in management as a way to kind of enact health policy. And that ultimately, by the end of the 80s, brought me to Blue Cross, where I thought it was a very large insurer, has a big say in how the state's health system operates. I think it actually has less now than it did in those days, but in those days. And so I felt like even in management, I could have a big impact on health policy in our state. And I think I did. I shouldn't say I did. I think Blue Cross did in the 90s, because it was a very fertile time for trying to take on some of the aspects of changing how healthcare is delivered. And so the rest is history from there. But it was really the thread of health policy. So along the way, as far as politics goes, I was active in campaigns, clearly, in some presidential campaigns. Gary Hart, certainly John Kerry, et cetera. Paul Tsongas in particular, I was the healthcare advisor for his campaign, his presidential campaign. But as far as running myself, I did run for selectman, and was for a couple of terms, and was our chairman there in my town of Wellesley. But it wasn't with the idea that somehow I was going to build up from that base. It was really just to kind of be a good citizen in Wellesley, I think. So anyway, by the time we got to the last election, I had sort of gone through a lot of my business management and business career, and it was a long-held dream to see if I could impact for the good someplace like Massachusetts, originally with health policy, but even larger. And it was an open primary, with Governor Patrick stepping down, so that really led me to run. But it was just a great opportunity to be able to try it.
You worked your buns off for a year too, I think, didn't you?
I did. It really is a 7-day-a-week, 24/7, and I'm sure if you've talked to others, it's all the same.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found was you feel intently that it's a race. So every day you're not doing something, you think the others are, and it spurs you and your team to make sure you've got things scheduled and you're doing something. And I also think probably what everybody feels is you feel so beholden to your supporters, that they really do an enormous amount of work and effort, all on their time, in their own ways, and you don't want to let them down, so it kind of drives you forward as well. And then, people mostly that do run for those kinds of offices, me included, are pretty competitive, so you don't really want you want to win, and those are all the reasons. But I have said to people who've asked, it's kind of exhilarating and exhausting at the same time, because you're really energized about the people you're meeting, the policies you get to talk about, and at the same time it is a 7-day schedule and you're pretty tired most of the time.
You get that positive energy, it's contagious, but it does exhaust you at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So
I wasn't having any trouble sleeping, excuse me.
So how do you feel about where the Commonwealth is today, looking back on your run for governor and where we are today? Do you think it's moving in the direction you would have liked to have seen it, to see us move, or where would you think we need to work more?
That's a great question. I think a lot of the issues that we talked about have sort of played out. Certainly the issues of the unfortunate addiction crisis that we have, and the deadly toll that it's taking on our citizens. Healthcare costs continue to rise at an unsustainable rate. We do have the issue of paying for our infrastructure, and we're going to continue to have the issue of trying to spread economic development around the state. So those are kind of the big four, and education gets wrapped up into the economic development issue. And I would say we're making some limited progress on all of those, but not near enough to either move the state forward or certainly to solve the terrible addiction crisis that we've got. So I'd say, if we keep talking about these things in particular, you'll hear me say necessary but not sufficient. We're doing some of the necessary things, but not near the sufficient things that we're going to need to do to really make a difference.
Now, when you say sufficient, are you talking about funding, or are you talking about partnering up with the right interest groups? Or
You know, it's a combination of things depending on the issue. I think the state needs to be run in a very pragmatic way, and obviously the governor got elected as a manager, or at least that was the promise, and I think he is a manager to a degree, and I think
Well,
he's sort
you and Charlie Baker were parallels at one time, weren't you?
Yes, very much so.
Charlie was at what, Tufts?
Well, he was at Harvard, but interestingly enough, where I really knew Governor Baker was when he was still in the Weld administration in the 90s, and I was at Blue Cross, so as the CEO, so he and I used to have interactions there around healthcare primarily, and then I've known him ever since. And then when he left the Weld administration, he ended up at Harvard with his career then beyond that.
With a similar position that you had at Blue Cross Blue
exactly.
Shield.
So we have had parallel lives and an ongoing interest in healthcare, and certainly he does that. But what I find is you need leadership to move these things beyond management. So I do think he's a manager, and I do think he's been, convening the right people, getting the right input, even choosing the right things to measure to make a difference. But any leader above being a manager needs to choose a few big things that are his highest priorities and really go after them in ways that sometimes break the mold. So in the case of infrastructure, it does, and it does mean going after a revenue source.
Right.
In the case of addiction, I think it needs, we've done some things around the edges that are important, and certainly a lot of people are taking credit for it, but we still have 1,500 people dying this year, 3 times the number of car accidents, just like last year. And what's really missing is the added capacity for treatment, which we're not doing. The 100 beds on top of 2,400 is scratching the surface, not near enough. And a lot of this comes down to setting priorities, making it the highest priority, as you've said it was going to be, the administration said it was going to be, and then you have to change priorities and or find revenue to make that happen. You can't just operate only in this small box. And I think so far, with good intentions, we're staying in a very kind of limited scope on a lot of these bigger issues.
I think I've said it here on the show a number of times. I think the biggest lie in politics is that we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. You're always going to have some type of spending problem, and you can always point to spending mistakes.
Absolutely.
Whether you're buying groceries or for one family or you're running a state government. We need more revenue, plain and simple.
Well,
a lot more revenue.
I think we do. We feel like we're on a constant level playing field, and we really aren't. The recession took a big toll, certainly against the ongoing needs, and so a lot of things got cut back, which are now not replaced, but we're just picking up from there. And the state's revenue system, I learned this when running, is disproportionately dependent on capital gains revenue from investment gains. We're a kind of a finance center, et cetera, and compared to many other states. So as those sectors took a hit, there was a disproportionate cutback in the revenue available to the state. So someday we may have to come to grips with that, but in the meantime, the idea that, well, we're all back to normal so the state can just pick up where it left off 8 years ago, it's not really true. We're behind the 8 ball, and I think where it really comes home to roost is around mental health and addiction, because those are hard things to get dollars for anyway, and now we're in a crisis on the addiction side, and we're not really spending the dollars we need in order to treat the people to prevent either further addiction, certainly death.
I think we'll be in a crisis infrastructure-wise if we don't upgrade a lot of bridges, a lot of roads, and water systems, and power grids.
So speaking as a private citizen, I completely agree with you. And also, you can't build an economy around a decaying infrastructure. There's too many other places where businesses can locate in this world. So you've got to have the workforce and you've got to have the infrastructure. And that's what we should be focusing on. And we're not going to do it. We're already pretty debt heavy from the big dig. So we're not going to do it by just adding more debt to our, like taking out a loan. What we do have to do, I think, is have a dedicated revenue source, so it doesn't go into the general fund and it really gets dedicated. So that's what the federal government did with the Federal Government Highway Trust Fund, which it's not funding enough, but at least it's separated. And I think, and I said during the campaign, I think we need to go to some combination of a gas tax or tolling tax so that the users of the infrastructure pay a little more of their fair share than the non-users, or those who use it less. And people often say, especially the liberal Democrats, "Well, that's regressive. Everybody, has to drive a car, et cetera." Yeah, nothing is perfect, but I can tell you, it's painless. Our gas is now a third, was a half for a while, a third of what it used to be. It's going to stay low for a long time. If there was ever a time to try and add either some tolling mechanism or a gas tax for people who are on the roads, now would be the time. During the campaign,
We voted it down.
yeah, during the campaign, it got voted down pretty heavily. But I think what people objected to was the indexing of it to the future, and that's what I objected to. Frankly, that was the only one of our Democratic candidates that objected to that. They all, the rest of the Democrats all thought, well, this is a good way to just sort of lock this in, and then the legislature doesn't have to deal with it. Well, that's what they're paid for, to deal with tax increases, and the governor too. And I said during the campaign, I don't believe in indexing, but I do believe in the gas tax as a dedicated source. And I would think the job of the governor is to lead that fight, to make that case. And I still do. So, in this case, because I have been on the record so long, that way, I have no problem with saying I think our current governor ought to do that. He needs to do that. And we need more money for the T, obviously, and we definitely need to do the things we talked about, like the South Coast Rail, which are always just going to stay a gleam in somebody's eye and far into the future if we don't get a dedicated revenue source that starts to create the funds for this.
What would you call a dedicated revenue source? What would be a realistic dedicated revenue source like the South Coast Rail?
Well, I think a revenue source for transportation and infrastructure generally, so I don't think it has to be dedicated just to the South Coast Rail. And then there'll always be some trade-offs on priorities, but we need a bigger pot, clearly. And I don't know what the politics of this is going to be, but if we wait all the way through the Baker administration and neither the legislature nor Governor Baker stand up, it's 3 or 4 more years at least before we even get on to creating that kind
We're
of revenue.
screwing our kids
I think we are.
and
yeah.
our grandchildren.
But I think it's more than just bad roads and bridges. It really is businesses that are going to not want to come here.
We had that discussion with Representative Bill Strauss, who is the chair of the Transportation Committee, a couple of shows ago. And we were talking about innovative ways to finance transportation, like thinking about the tolls around the inner rings
Yes,
of cities
exactly.
and trying to control tolling based on times of traffic and all
yeah.
of that.
Exactly.
And these things take some courage to put forward, but I think we need more political courage in order to come up with
Maybe
something new.
that's the commodity that's in shortest supply right now that we really need. So, and I don't mean just the governor, because I think there's a kind of an unholy alliance, frankly, as a private citizen, between the governor and the legislature. They're all reinforcing each other's willingness to not be very aggressive on anything to make it safe. And that's not the purpose of the state government, to make it safe. At least, I'm not talking about personal safety, I'm talking about their seats and getting reelected. And I think ultimately you have to shake that up a bit. So the governor could have done that, or some of the leadership in the Senate or the House, but it's got to happen. It can't be the fact that all three of them all agree on everything, nobody really debates anything, and everything stays in a neat little box that's not going to jeopardize anybody's ability to get reelected.
And kick it down the road.
Yeah.
Maybe it's going to take a petition by the citizens in order to change things if the legislature won't do it. I mean, like they're doing with lifting the charter cap and some of these other ballot questions, may be a way to kind of,
Well,
hey, listen, this is important.
think that's a good thought and certainly an option. I don't favor a referendum government because it's really a blunt instrument, except for the very biggest things. Like if there's a huge civil rights issue that somehow the legislature's missing, that might lend itself. But things that require definition and any kind of nuance don't do well with referendums. And I guess the medical marijuana referendum is a good example. It got passed overwhelmingly, and it took 2 or 3 years and 2 attempts, really, to even get the regulations so we could implement it. This is stuff that could have that's their job, gotten hashed out in a legislature of people elected by the citizens to have created a lot more fine print around what that medical marijuana law ultimately looked like. So that could happen again with other kinds of referendums. And
Referendums become such emotional issues too, rather than, and reason gets pushed aside.
Yeah.
Gut reactions come to the forefront.
Absolutely. I think you see it in California. They're kind of state run by referendum, and it really seesaws back and forth and isn't very stable. So democracy is never easy, and certainly I think we're all learning how fragile it can be, and I certainly had great respect for it as I got out there and was running. But it takes people that are willing to have some political courage, as you said. I think one of the things that I wanted to do in running was reintroduce the idea of a citizen politician. I guess naively thought that, well, you know, you could have a career where you learn some things and then apply that to the state government. And so the state government ought to be a place where people could come in and out of it at various times in their career, and certainly once they've got something to offer. And what I found is we have a pretty locked down system with a lot of people who are pretty much professional politicians who live that way. And I'm not sure it serves us that well. I would like to see more citizen politician input. I think people would be more...
Now you sound more like Evan Falchek.
Yes, I know. Maybe in that respect, maybe I do, for sure. I don't think he's wrong on that. I think the idea of you'd have more political courage. People realize this isn't their whole life. Their whole reason for being isn't winning the next election. They can stand for what they can believe in, and I think it would serve us better if we did that collectively.
Well, I think it's also important coming from the local level. You were a selectman, I myself was a selectman, to begin there and kind of learn, and it doesn't take a lot of money to run on the local level.
Yeah, absolutely.
But as you start to move up the food chain, it gets to be a lot more expensive.
It does, and that was the other thing about running is all the money you have to raise, and I feel so beholden to all the people that contributed money to my campaigns. That is a huge issue, and only going to get bigger until we change the laws around that.
You kicked in a big hunk yourself, too.
I did, yeah. So I was able to do that, and that's good, but a lot of people aren't.
Yeah.
So we're going to miss a lot of talent if it requires that much money to run.
Especially when you get beyond the state level and you start going national, I think we
Yeah.
do miss out on a lot of potential candidates because it's just so expensive, it's just so crazy.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
Why run?
Absolutely. And then in the case of congressmen, running every 2 years, it's like it is a permanent campaign, given the amount of money it takes to run in that circumstance. I do think it's disappointing that we've allowed SuperPACs into the state government at the governor's level. I think the Citizens United is a disaster for the country. Ultimately, we have to change that. But to now start doing it in the governor's races, which is what happened last time around, I think is really unfortunate. And certainly Governor Baker is tending that way going
Right
forward.
now.
But there were Democrats that had super PACs in the last election, and there was efforts by all of us to say, why don't we pledge not to do that? And of course, we couldn't get a consensus on all of us to do that. And I think that was a mistake, because I think if we had agreed as Democrats that we weren't going to go the super PAC route, then I think it would have been harder for Charlie Baker to have done it in the general election. And it would be hard. But I think we've now set a precedent that's a little hard to reverse, and I think that's much to our detriment.
And even the governor now, it was in the paper the other day, is going to be more or less using PAC donors. The more money they give, the greater access they have to the governor.
My
I think
gosh,
that's kind
what
of
a
a very
terrible-
scary,
what
a
a
very
terrible
scary thought.
Thought. I mean, yeah, it's exactly what we don't want in a democracy, right?
Yeah, push ordinary people out of the process is
Yeah.
a terrible thing.
There is an upside that I think the presidential election is showing that those who are shunning the super PACs winning a lot of votes
Doing pretty
just
well.
through the fact that they're shunning super PACs, whether it be Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders. Yeah.
I think that's the first lesson, which is really interesting, that people, because it's been very hard to galvanize people around that issue. Most people generally around financing issues, it's like a secondary issue. You know, they don't expect that it's all going to be cleaned up, and so it's hard to bring it to a high level, top tier issue, and it does look like it has so far in the primary. And the second thing that I think we've learned about the super PACs is it's a lot of money. It doesn't get you very far sometimes. I mean, Jeb Bush and others
Yeah,
spending
ooh.
just an incredible amount of money and got nowhere, obviously. So maybe that's some more evidence that this is a bad thing to do.
That had to be painful. I feel bad for Jeb Bush.
Yeah.
But you can't
Yeah.
feel bad for his billionaire backers.
No,
I
Although
guess,
that
yeah.
money could have gone to a lot of other
lot of other
good
good
things,
things.
you're talking
education. or-
$60,000 a vote or something
Yeah.
in primaries.
I'll tell you, I work in a very international company, so a lot of my colleagues are in Europe and Eurasia, and in Europe, they are paying so much attention to this, and they're absolutely stunned. They could never believe how long the process was
Yeah.
or how much money it is. It just doesn't factor into how
Yeah.
their
Exactly.
governments work. But now to see the kind of the behavior is just,
It seems contrary to what a democracy is supposed to be.
yeah. And they're quite alarmed, to tell you the truth,
I
about
know they are,
some of the things that are being said. Because they don't know how to judge how real it is and what that would really mean for the
Neither
next
do we.
administration. And I think we're all finding we don't either. But
Great Britain's going through similar contortions.
yeah. Well, actually, several places in Europe.
Yeah.
There was a very far-right party in France that surprised everybody.
Yeah.
Ultimately, there was a subsequent election that didn't play out the way
Yeah.
they wanted to. Angela Merkel's under a lot more pressure from anti-immigrant sentiment anyway in Germany. And there's this far-right part in Austria that's got a lot more credence than it did a few years ago. So a lot of it's being driven by immigration issues, but still, it's not a good trend.
No. Austria's always had a penchant for the far right anyway.
Yeah, they have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me in 1 minute about PAREXEL, what that is.
It's an interesting, fascinating company. I've been there about 10 years. We do the clinical research trials, the big clinical studies that get done to help decide how the drugs work that end up being our new drugs. So, companies or hospitals or institutes come up with a compound that they think might work as a drug. They've
So if
tested
I
it in
invent
animals.
something that would grow hair on
Yeah.
a person like me,
Yeah,
I give it to your
exactly.
company and say, test this and make sure
Yeah,
it's...
so it's a little more than testing it, because it's go through a series of what might be 10 years of clinical research trials that help determine what the dosage would be, what the side effects are, if there are any, if it really works or not ultimately. And that's all the data that ends up going to the FDA to approve the drug for sale, or all the other regulatory agencies around the world.
Now, do all drug companies use a company, or do they do that themselves normally?
Well, so Big Pharma always used to do it themselves till about 10 or 15 years ago, and decided it was too expensive for them to keep what's getting to be more and more of a global effort, keep all those employees hired. So so they outsourced it then to companies like ours. And then the little biotech companies, of which there are hundreds, they're not staffed up to do anything like that. So they always outsource it to us. So that's what the company is.
Geez, Paul, we'll have to have him come back and explain this whole how to get drugs to market and whether you can negotiate drug prices and,
and
the
the
hot button
ethical
issue.
implications.
Yeah.
Well, it's a
of all-
fascinating area, and what the right fixes are is really worth discussing for sure.
Good,
Well, we'd love to have you back to discuss that.
good,
That'd be my
good.
pleasure.
I'm Paul Latendra. Thank you to our very esteemed guest, Joe Avellone.
Thank you, Paul.
And thank you to Kim Murphy, Walter Sabina, and Ben Forty at TCAM TV, our gracious hosts. They let us use the studios. They make us exist. Let us exist.
And I'm Julie Taylor, and look for us on Facebook at South Coast Matters, and also reach out to us at southcoastmatters@gmail.com.
Thank you for watching.